Thank you all for joining us today. This is, as you might imagine, the blueprint for democracy, how we can stop being ripped off. We're going to really focus on restructuring the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. And then we're going to talk about strengthening lobbyist and ethics law. And as you might imagine, a lot of this has to do with our recent history with House Bill 6. But we're going to actually take a little bit of a trip back in time in both of the presentations. And we are really blessed today to hear from two wonderful speakers who are going to give us some ideas about ways to reform things. Well, we have hit 7:02. Looks like we are set to go. I just wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Terser. Welcome to Blueprint for Democracy, how we can stop being ripped off. We are going to talk about a variety of different things, but as you noticed the slide, hey, Trevor, why don't you move us along? So I wanted to start by taking a look back at last week. So last week we heard from Aristotle Hutras, and he talked about how the Legislative Service Commission records are not considered public records, meaning we don't get access to that information, so we don't actually know who first writes legislation. Did they come from lobbyists? Did the legislators hand them in? It also makes it a little bit more difficult for us to actually look at who is proposing amendments. We have these substitute bills and there are amendments to it, but we don't actually know who owns them, which is hard to have greater accountability if you don't actually know who's responsible to changes of legislation. So one of the things we talked about was the importance of this greater transparency at the Legislative Service Commission. And the proposal was that we get this transparency, but that we also do it by honoring Jim Siegel. Now, Jim was a champion for open government and worked at the Columbus Dispatch. And this is a picture of him sitting here. And I have to say, you know, I still miss Jim. And I think it's really important for us when we're thinking about transparency and accountability to think back to those folks who've been working on open records and open government for a really long time and to move forward, you know, in their honor. And so I just wanted to highlight that. And if you will put into the chat a way for folks to take action, as you might imagine, the Jim Siegel bill does not exist. At this point, it's a proposal, it's an idea. We are calling on legislators to get started and to actually introduce this legislation. Now, if you're willing to move to the next slide, I did want to highlight, since we met on Monday of last week, we had a couple different things that happened. So one of the things that was interesting on when we got together on the 16th was on that day, there was a raid at Sam Randazzo's house. Now, Sam was the chair of the Public Utilities Commission. And on Thursday, First Energy admitted that they gave $4 million to somebody who regulates them. Didn't say Sam Randazzo, just said someone who regulates them. And then on Friday, Sam Randazzo stepped aside. He resigned. And so, you know, it's really important when we're having this kind of shakeup at the Public Utilities Commission to think about ways to create greater accountability. And so I'm just really pleased that we're here today and we're going to hear from Ned Hill. If you can move the slide again. Oh, here we go. If you go back. So I wanted to highlight Cleveland Mayor Tom Johnson. You might imagine this was a while ago, but this is what he said more than 100 years ago about electric monopolies. If you don't own them, they will own you in time. Next slide. I think it's important to have a little bit of history before we go into Ned's overview. So in 1911, the Public Service Act created the Public Service Commission. In 1913, the Public Service Commission became the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. In 1982, the Public Utilities Nominating Council established by law says that the list of possible appointees a governor chooses from should be comprised of people deemed the most qualified. Now, 1982 was also a year where a citizen initiative failed. Many of you will think about Henry Eckert, and many of you who are old school will remember, Henry as being a wonderful consumer advocate and pushing Ohioans to elect the Public Utilities Commission. But that was repudiated in 1982, in part because they established this public nominating council. In 1997, First Energy was founded. But of course, First Energy was around a really long time because the Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company was also around for the turn of the century. Not the one that you all lived through, but the one before that. And so that's a little bit of history. Now, I would like to introduce you to Ned Hill. Now, Ned is incredibly accomplished. He is a professor of economic development in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs and in the Knowlton College of Architecture's section on city and regional planning. Ned is a wonderful teacher, and he was recruited to OSU from Cleveland State. And so he has a long history of thinking about all of these different ways that we could actually have good public policy, where we could actually have policies that benefit consumers. And you will notice at the bottom of the slide, he says, these comments are my own. I think that's important to remember that these are the recommendations of Ned Hill. And Professor Hill, take it away.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And I'm honored and pleased to be asked to talk to you tonight. I will complete the sentence. These are my opinions. They're based on research, work I've been doing on electric utilities. I've been testifying against First Energy since 2014 or 2015, and have been involved with discussions about utilities. So if we go to the next slide, we can continue. When I was going through my Thomas Nast cartoons, I decided to look at the Billy Ireland collection at Ohio State, and this really strikes me as right. So this is a cartoon that was published in by Fred Morgan drew it. It was published in Philadelphia in 1912. The great trust buster Teddy Roosevelt's in front, and the octopus of the trusts are behind him, saying even though you have the mask or the face of a trust buster, their tentacles are going to get everywhere. And that's actually a part of one of the great dilemmas about what do you do about something called the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. You mentioned the House Bill 6 scandal, the resignation of Sam Randazzo, the chair, but what we really have to say at the heart of all this is not just the egregious allegation of $60 million to push through one piece of special interest legislation, but also look at the other dark money that has come out of the utilities to influence the political process. Political money by the IOUs. I like the fact that the investor-owned utilities, the shorthand is IOUs. So IOU, so you owe us, seems to be about how things work here. They think of their political money as an investment, and they want a return on that investment. Now, for some reason, there's just much less drama historically over natural gas, and this has been true historically. But since deregulation of the electric generating market, starting in 2002 and really picking up in around 2016, the amount of cash that's been flying around Capitol Square is just jaw-dropping, obnoxious. And the IOUs use political power to generate market power. And that market power means using political influence to set rates and to figure out winners and losers. And frankly, there have been changes within this industry that have changed what should be regulated. And that's what I'll be talking about quite briefly. Next slide, please. So there are two root problems to all this. This is the original cartoon about the original gerrymander, by the way. Catherine's seen this before. I tend to use it whenever anyone says gerrymander. See my cartoon. So there are two root problems behind here. The first is unaccountable speech. So the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court essentially created dark money. which is special interest money that goes and gets shield impacts. And so political speech is made that's not that is unaccountable. And we have to find a way to end dark money. It can be done technologically, but it really is a federal problem. And so if corporations can put in unaccountable amounts of money to influence political discourse and not be held accountable for it, then the free marketplace of ideas is thoroughly perverted. The second problem we've got is gerrymandered districts. So it means that if you have a severely gerrymandered district, the only election that counts if you're investing in a candidate is the primary. And because of that, you find that people come out of that primary have some allegiance to the business that invested in them. And frankly, I as much as I'd like to think that the pure winds of democracy would clear out the cobwebs of the PUCO, as long as there's dark money and gerrymandering, it won't work. And in fact, I think the progressives of 1912 were right about the short ballot. If we put PUCO members up for election, it'll just be a cheaper election to purchase. So I don't want to go there. Instead, I think we have to change behaviors. Next slide, please. So sunshine is the single most important thing we could do when it comes to the PUCO, which means that business secrets should not exist if you're going to use the police powers of the state to generate private revenues. Right now, winners and losers and costs on the part of the utilities can be hidden from public view or hidden by arcane accounting because of the fact that the PUCO believes that their activities reflect business secrets on the part of business. If a business wants the public's money, there should be no secrets. There's something called reasonable arrangements at work underneath the economic development riders. Those are the economic development subsidies. So that if Amazon comes into town and they say, we're going to do great stuff and we're only going to use renewable energy, great. But meanwhile, they're also in to get a reasonable arrangement. Now, when there's a reasonable arrangement, they get a discount on their electricity, but it isn't coming from the utility. What happens is that discount gets spread to the rest of the rate base. And so you've got PUCO picking winners and losers. And this reasonable arrangements means that the utility bar becomes a way of putting through cash and also increasing political power. These things have to go. Any of the cost exemptions that exist within the riders should be made perfectly public. So each of the utilities files something called and pass something called Electric Security Plan, an ESP. Well, within that is a set of special tailored discounts that go to a very small number of companies, and the cost of those discounts get spread to their competitors. That is just wrong. It's lemon socialism. It's picking winners and losers, and it's not how markets work. We need to lower barriers to understanding what's going on. And the problem we've got is the PUCO itself is an arcane, adversarial, quasi-judicial agency. And that means that you have to understand the history of the laws. Things are written so it's imperceptible. And a general purpose reporter cannot understand what's going on. Our great reporters that used to cover the PUCO are all moved off to either retired or to industry newsletters, and that means that the cost of understanding what's going on in that organization is too high. And so PUCO is a place where rational ignorance on the part of consumers exists, and that's where redistributive coalitions meet. Now that's technical terms, but a redistribution coalition is a group that agrees to support a utility as it goes for its electric security plan. They each get a cut. I love Ohio. You can actually see the cut and what they get in the documents. And in fact, we'll be reviewing that in December when I file testimony. And what you don't see is who picks up the bills. And we need to get that. Also, the other thing that I love about the PUCO, and go in there and you see that raft of attorneys, realize the utilities attorneys are paid for by the ratepayers, and the adversaries attorneys are paid usually by nonprofits. I mean, I made a comment once when I was testifying, who was against? Oh, First Energy. that triggered an objection on the part of the attorneys. I counted 13 attorneys in a rugby scrum. I asked the hearing officer, how much is that costing the ratepayer? And they took offense to it. And the same way is true with legislation that you talked about last week. The legislation should be written in plain English, and the writers should actually describe what takes place. So we need to end the PUCO's legally permissible corrupting practices. Notice, I didn't say they're corrupt. I didn't say they're illegal, but they're corrupting, because what it does is it puts dark money at play and increases the political power of the utilities because they can afford to play the game. In fact, they get subsidized to do it. Insider deals and electric security plans have to go. Reasonable arrangements on rates have to go. We need to make certain in a marketplace that similar companies and similar businesses and similar households get similar treatment. And trade secret financial information has got to disappear from the books. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm getting cranked up. Now, when we deal with particularly both the electricity and the gas industries, those are three separate markets. There is the generating market, and that's where you make electrons. There's a transmission market where you check when you ship those electrons from a generating plant to a place where they get distributed. And then there's the distribution, the wires that go to our houses and homes and businesses. The only part that's now a natural monopoly is the distribution network. That needs regulation. The state of Ohio freed up generation. The utilities are losing that, and they're trying to take generation back underneath their skirts, and they're trying to protect their revenues by denying competition from starting up in the transmission area. And this is wrong. The PUCO should stick by the rule of that what they do is they encourage low cost, reliable power and encourage competition. And what they really have to do is monitor the regional multi-state generating market to make certain it doesn't get monopolized. There is in the State House a myth that Ohio once upon a time was self-sufficient in terms of the electricity we generated. False. We've always imported electricity except for 1 year during the Great Recession. And so when we took the electric generating market, made it competitive, and we could buy electricity across the region, the purchase price went down, reliability went up. The legislature will want you to think that the purchase price went up and reliability went down. They got it. The technical term is back-asswards, pardon my language. And we need to build equal access to rates to industries and commercial customers, so there are no negotiated deals and no inside politics. And we need to reflect the reality and benefits of the regional transmission grid. So next slide, and I'll talk faster. So what do we do about House Bill 6? House Bill 6 was written in a way to make it impenetrable and confusing, and to make certain that no one understands it. And they threw so much stuff in there that you can't keep the argument separated. So let me make it simple. We've got a nuclear subsidy that's being demanded, not because the nuclear plant it can't make electrons efficiently. In fact, the regional grid says it's pretty efficient. The reason why that plant can't make money is all the debt that has been incurred with the bad business mistakes of First Energy since the year 2000. Understand that with the mandated Energy Harbor audit, the fix is in. That audit's going to show that those plants need the subsidy. Why? Because the bankruptcy court counted the House Bill 6 money in as revenue and protected, as they should, the bondholders. So if House Bill 6 hadn't been there, the more bondholders would have lost money, and a more competitive power plant would have come out through the bankruptcy process. The OVIC bailout, that's an old coal-fired, two campuses of coal-fired plants, gets more uncompetitive every year, and we have an open blank check, so it's very difficult to estimate what the subsidy is going to be over the time of the bailout. Decoupling, this is just a beauty. What it says is it guarantees First Energy the revenue it got in 2018, a high revenue year. So it's like we go to Honda and say, don't worry if you have a bad year selling cars. If you don't sell the cars, we'll give you the revenue instead. It is lemon socialism. We have to stop the gold-plated, politically connected utility scale solar projects. Why? Because markets are making solar more competitive, and we're going to lock in high-cost producers. I believe we need to rely on free markets to promote renewable power, not mandates, because that gets the camel's nose underneath the tent to try to disrupt what markets are doing. And we've done work jointly with Cleveland State and my research group that shows that the generating market has saved the consumers money, but the IOUs have gone in and used their political muscle with the PUCO to claw all that money back through riders. It's pretty ugly. And I guess the last thing I can say is the IOUs deserve a rate of return on their invested capital. They deserve a rate of return on their distribution network. We need a full rate hearing to give them a rate return on the capital, but then free up their customers to do what's in their best interest. Next slide, and I think I'm done at the end of this one. So we should not put a barrier in front of energy conservation. When I read this, my brain just had a warp spasm. And that's because if a company goes and puts in place energy conservation measures that saves them electricity, a portion of that savings goes to the IOU. Tell me how that works in a real world. And so the IOUs deserve to make certain that their capital base is invested in and maintained. We already pay them to do that. So what they end up doing is using their political money to essentially wire the process. And that also, when it comes to the selection PUCO commissioner selection committee that's in the law, you could see the influence of the utilities even when it comes to the union representative, because it represents the workers in their generating plants and in their companies, rather than workers in plants that they're competing against. So I talked as fast as I could, but I hope I made it clear. So Catherine, do you have any questions?
The goal was not to talk as fast as you can, but I appreciate it. Well, fortunately, this gives us a lot of time for questions. And I have to say, I think it's very likely that folks do have questions. Most of us are not utility experts. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to ask you questions. Some of them we've gotten from Facebook, a couple we've gotten from here. And so the first question I have is, the governor has 30 days from Friday to nominate a new commissioner, and there will be a nomination process coming up next year. That's when Dennis Dieter's term ends.
Right.
Would you improve the Public Utilities Nominating Commission?
Well, the first thing is complete transparency on the part of the candidates. And that transparency has to be public. And it may lower the pool of the candidates, so people don't want to reveal sources of income or where their investments are. But we have to make certain that the candidates are essentially free of conflicts of interest. The real problem that we got, and the governor faces this, is that to find someone who is knowledgeable with utility law, they have to have been part of the utility bar and practice, and probably have conflicts. So what's a tolerable level of conflict? The other problem that we saw with the process is that I think the Senate has to confirm the candidate. And we saw the strength of the utilities when it came to considering Howard Petrikoff as a commissioner. So I don't have a good answer other than a total complete commitment to sunshine on this in this case.
One of the questions that I got, which was part of comment, the Public Utilities Ohio, the PUCO's, you can see why I'm tripping over my own tongue. The PUCO's nominating commission appears to have issues because legislators select industry lobbyists to represent them.
Correct.
What can we do about that?
Well, this is, first off, trying to get the press to cover this is important. Unfortunately, there isn't a press that covers this. So it is true that the legislature has nominated people with utility connections to go there. So at the end, I think what's really important is that we should have complete disclosure. And here's the dark money problem of how much utility money is ended up in the campaign funds of the legislator, as well as the caucus legislative funds. AEP did nothing wrong when they committed dark money to the same pool of money that First Energy got a little carried away with in putting their dark money together. But it was only revealed because AEP thought that it was going to come out in the wash as householders' PAC was starting to be turned upside down by the FBI.
So one of the questions that I had to do with Sam Randazzo, because it looked like he was on that nominating, he was on the nominating process or on that council, and then he actually became the chair, and that just seemed like this weird conflict of interest.
Well, I think Julie Carr Smythe wrote a terrific story that kind of goes to the history of Randazzo's appointment. The conflict is less that he came off the nominating committee and into the position and then to chair. It kind of it reads as if it was preordained and wired. At the end of the day, I don't think it makes any difference. I mean, the conflict was there to start with. So the issue to me is, why was it not revealed publicly, the financial conflicts that were revealed last week? And it was only revealed because you had, it's really interesting. Maybe we should hire the FBI to vet all candidates for positions. They seem to give a pretty good job of figuring out what's going on.
Well, this leads me to thinking about, I mentioned Henry Eckert kind of early when I was beginning this conversation. And the reason I was thinking about it is that, he really devoted his life to thinking about consumers and to thinking about what can we do to actually make the Consumer Council reflect us and address our concerns and make sure that ratepayers are not taken advantage of. And so the solution that he was wedded to had to do with electing the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. And I know that's not something that you're a fan of. So I just wanted you to just explain a little bit about why you're not a fan of that and how you would address this slightly differently. Right.
The reason why I'm not a fan of it is that we saw what the role of dark money was in the householder enterprise, I think is what the affidavit referred to it as. Dark money will find its way into an election for PUCO commissioners, and I think will make a bad system even worse. I would be much more favorably disposed towards elections if dark money didn't exist, but it's here. So this is one where I think transparency is important. In kind of Henry Eckert's memory, I have a proposal that will have no traction at all, but it's kind of fun to think of, and that is I strongly urge and believe that for every dollar that the IOUs spend on ratepayer subsidized attorneys, a matching dollar go to the Ohio Consumer Council to spend on accountants, verifiers, and also to develop and strengthen the opponent bar. This is supposed to be an adversarial proceedings, but one adversary has their lawyers paid for by the ratepayers. The other adversary gets their lawyers paid for by passing tin cups. So for those of us who struggle with acronyms, what is an IOU? IOU, an investor-owned utility. An acronym is IOU, and I just love it because whenever I see IOU, I see them saying IOU and you owe me. All right, so the next question that I have is, the FBI says this is probably the biggest bribery scandal in Ohio's history. Is utility-related corruption new? Hell no. And it's not unique to Ohio. And that is just because of the way the rate of return from investing in politics works. And utility money is the mother's milk of politics. And the only way we can get it cleaned up is by revealing every nickel and dime of it, not only coming from the utility itself, but coming from their employees and the relatives of the employees. Again, the Supreme Court has said that a business is a legal person. The legal person has right to free speech on a par with a human person, but the legal person doesn't have to be accountable for their speech, and that's obnoxious.
Well, this brings the next kind of question, which has to do, if we were to shine a light on dark money, actually require disclosure and in addition, create what I would think of as anti-coordination rules. Because right now we know there are a number of legislators who have, dark money groups, or, elected officials that have dark money groups. And I think part of that is we don't have really good anti-coordination language in our law. And on top of that, we have this whole issue of course, anything that you do in secret is very hard not to take advantage of. If in fact we address the dark money and we put a light right on that thing, would it be worth reconsidering the election of the people who sit on the Public Utilities Commission?
Yeah, then that becomes feasible. But the current system of appointment would work much better if there was no dark money. The other thing that we need to do, because this is the electronic age, is that filing of money should be instantaneous. As soon as the check hits, it becomes public. Then, of course, the fool around will say, "Trust me, the money's coming." But cash on the barrelhead makes a difference. So in my simple mind, I'd like to, when things get very confusing, I try to make it as simple as possible. And it's that combination of dark money and gerrymandered districts is just what poisons. That's what poisons the well.
Well, as we all know, we're going into 2021 map making. We'll have to have a conversation about that on December 14th at 7 p.m. So I'm going to encourage you all to participate in that discussion. And
Catherine, you can have a party game. Name that district. So you can put up the district and say, what animal does this remind you of? You'll have the Lake Erie snake, the Jim Jordan duck, and the cascading set of toilet seats that starts in Akron and ends up in Columbus.
Well, I have to say, one of my favorite lines, this was years ago, but you testified and you called talked about Jim Jordan's district, and you said he was shaking his tail feathers over there in Mercer County. And that caught my funny bone. How's that?
That works. But the duck bill on this district ate Oberlin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anyway, we could get really off topic and start to talk about gerrymandering. We're not going to do that.
Thank you.
I have another question for you. So here is the question. In 2008, the legislature established rules regarding seat or significantly excessive earnings test. In the budget bill last year, that's House Bill 166, included an amendment that gave special treatment to First Energy. Could you explain seat and its role in utility policy?
Actually, I really can't. For that one, I rely on attorneys to figure it out. I've tried reading it, and my ears blew off at one point. I just can't. As a professor, I hate to say I don't know, but I'm going to have to confess.
Well, that is perfectly acceptable. I think for a lot of us, utility policy is super complicated. I think one of the things that I think is really important is to remember that in 2019, First Energy got special privileges when it came to the significant earning tests, which basically says you can't go above this number for how much you earn. They got a special dispensation to include all of their different companies.
Right.
We got that, they got that, and then House Bill 6. So I think it's important for us to think about the kind of how often the utilities really benefit from what happens at the State House.
Well, and also one other part that's particularly obnoxious about House Bill 6 is this decoupling thing. And decoupling means we have decoupled your revenues from what you actually sell. So if you remove the incentive for a company to increase its earnings by becoming more efficient, what you're going to do is you're going to make a cost more expensive for the consumer. Now, Northeast Ohio is the second slowest growing region in the state. And they are not going to be benefited by increasing electricity bills and skyrocketing transmission bills. So what House Bill 6 is essentially made the rock that Northeast Ohio has to push to build their economy much bigger and heavier.
Let's do this. So I had somebody that was concerned about the Ohio Consumer Council having less funding and some other changes. For example, I don't remember, a few years ago, they were prohibited from having a call center to address complaints.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered if you had any comments on a way to make our Consumer Council more robust.
Well, I've got a conflict of interest because on this, so I have to reveal it, given the nature of the organization I'm talking to. I will be testifying on behalf of Ohio Consumers Council in a case against EP&L very soon. I'm not charging them, however. But Ohio's Consumer Council is a rare bird across the states. And it really does look out for the consumer, particularly in an area, utility law and regulation, which is arcane. And it's just so hard for a casual observer to understand what's going on. And it's clear that the bill that was put into the Ohio House a few months ago to cut their funding was retribution for and testimony to the effectiveness of Ohio's Consumer Council. So if we're trying to build a level playing field and improve the economic competitive position of Ohio by having competitive electricity rates, the Ohio Consumer Council plays a vital role. So again, my recommendation is the Consumer Council gets funding from the Ohio General Fund, but also the utility pays for every dollar that they pay for their attorneys. A dollar goes to the Ohio Consumer Council to make certain we have balance in an advocacy process, an adversarial process, sorry.
So are you familiar with House Bill 786?
Give me a title rather than a number.
Basically, this is from the people who are participating. I am not familiar with it. It said, would you comment on House Bill 786 recently dropped into the House, which would enable the sitting board to not certify commercial wind and solar in Ohio for at least 3 years?
No, I can't comment on that one. I just don't know it well enough.
Well, one of the things that we do know is when we go through all of these questions, we're going to create more questions and more discussion. So not next week, but the following week on December 14th, we're actually having a discussion of all of the different ideas that we've talked about. So I'm going to be trying to narrow down with a poll to try to figure out which topics we mostly want to talk about. And we may bother you, Professor Hill, again, just to get, to ask you a few questions. So here's a cheeky question. Is DeWine vulnerable with the Randazzo appointment?
I make it since I don't deal with partisan politics, I only stay with issues. This is a topic that I won't touch with a 20-foot pole. The governor has earned a lot of goodwill with his leadership when it comes to COVID-19, and I'm thankful for his leadership on that. I do think that the politics of House Bill 6, the householder indictment, and the chairman's resignation are just going to get progressively uglier.
Well, I wanted to say thank you. And I know for participants, we all want a chance to actually talk about these ideas and have a question, and explore and push back on some of the things that Ned Hill said today. So I'm going to really encourage you to join us on December 14th. Thank you very much, Professor. Now, our next thing we're going to do is a poll. So So I am a huge fan of wait, don't tell me. And so the poll's going to be popping up. Yeah, if you'll pull it up, that'd be great. Here it comes. So I was really, I love wait, don't tell me. And so the question is, pick out which of the scandals is not real. So the first one, to circumvent a $500 limit on speaking fees that each legislator could receive, lobbyists invited legislators to dinner parties, then invited multiple clients and asked each to bring $500 check for their legislator. Okay, so that's the first one. Is it real or not real? So I have to tell you, one of these is not real. Okay, next one. To circumvent campaign contribution limits, an official encouraged donors to contribute to a county party. Then he had that county political party send the contribution to him. Next, we have to keep extramarital affairs from their wives. 2 legislators hired their best friends' mistresses, then made sure that each of these women received identical pay raises and vacation days. Then we have to conceal the extent of a discount he received on a major home remodeling project from a state contractor. A governor's top aide altered the price tag of the project listed on the building permit needed for the work to begin. Then finally, this is the next choice that you might decide is real or not real. A major political donor who owned a rare coin shop convinced Ohio to change the rules and allow an array of risky, unconventional investments in things like rare coins and beanie babies.
And I don't know the answer to that one.
Okay, people, pick the one that you believe is not a real scandal in the state of Ohio. Mia, how many people have voted? I don't want to actually finish the poll until we have a chance for people to actually, you all better not be using Wikipedia or Google. Right. Okay, so we're at 40%. Come on, people, or 55%. Come on, let's get that up there. All right, you guys, I'm going to pull the trigger. Okay, we're at 60%. Oh, so Susan says she wants to take hers back. All right, well, here it comes. No one actually gets a prize other than, the respect and acknowledgement of your peers. Okay, what's the answer, Mia? We have some very smart people here. So 60% of the people did, in fact, select the scandal that was not true. So I'm very impressed by that. So many of us will remember the pancake scandal where this was Aronoff and Vern Rife. I don't know how often you go to the Rife Tower, but that was the pancaking scandal. So a bunch of checks or a pancake. We also had the county party one. So people might say, well, wait a second, that happened more than once. And you would be correct about that. So you'll remember the Joe Dieters scandal, where he basically encouraged people who wanted to invest Ohio's money. He sent them off to the Hamilton County political party, and then it ended up coming back to him. And then you'll also remember that this is something that Householder did way back when. And so that one is very clear. Yes, there were no mistresses. And then as we think about the other scandals, who here was like, well, CoinGate, we know that one. That was really obvious. Following tonight's program, we're going to be sending you slides. This is not going to happen until tomorrow. We'll send you slides and recordings, and we will also send you a little bit about each of the scandals because, scandals can actually move us to good reform. And we want to take advantage of the current crisis, the current House Bill 6 householder enterprise scandal, so that we can actually move things along. And to do that, we're going to have a conversation with Kedric Payne. First of all, I'm going to introduce Nazik Hapasha. And so the thing that's wonderful about Nazik, I've known her for a number of years. She's with the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and she has a deep interest in all of these things. And I'm just going to hand it right off to you, Nazik.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here with everyone tonight and to introduce our next speaker, Kedric Payne. Kedric has a long list of impressive accomplishments and positions in his background, and I'll just share some of that. He is the General Counsel and Senior Director at the Campaign Legal Center. Kedric specializes in government ethics, lobbying law, and election law. He began his career in private practice and has since served in the 3 branches of government. Prior to joining CLC, he advised on executive branch ethics laws as a Deputy General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Energy. He also enforced legislative branch ethics laws and standards of conduct as Deputy Chief Counsel of the Office of Congressional Ethics, where he was one of the office's first investigators. Prior to OCE, Kedric practiced political law and advised lobbyists and government contractors on compliance with federal, state, and local laws governing campaign finance, lobbying, and ethics. Kedric also developed the first political law course for the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Kedric, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Nazik. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone for attending and allowing me to speak on this topic for just a few moments. I just want to touch on something that Professor Hill really highlighted in his presentation, and I think is part of the entire blueprint for democracy. And it's this theme that complex corruption requires complex reform, meaning that there's not one law that you can change that would address all of the different issues that occurred as a result of this most recent scandal. And you have to realize that when you have such a layered and intentional and orchestrated corruption activity and enterprise, that it's going to take the same amount of reform that is going to be orchestrated, that's going to be intentional, that's going to be layered in order for it to be effective. And I think that one part of an effective reform that is overlooked and that has to be included is lobbying law reform. And so what I want to do today is to talk about 2 things. One is just to explain how is lobbying law relevant to this scandal. You can think from the public news on this scandal and the indictment, which does not mention lobbying law at all, that maybe it's not an issue. Ironically, that is the issue, that you can have this type of activity and it does not cross the line when it comes to lobbying law, really points to the fact that your lobbying law does not have everything that it may need. And after discussing why lobbying law is relevant, I'd like to talk about what needs to change, to talk about what gaps need to be closed. All right. To put it in context, I want to just go into the history of it all. I think that a few times we've talked about the history of different scandals in Ohio, and I like to comment that scandals can move us to great reform. Well, here's an example of something that happened that may seem familiar back in 1935. Can we move to the next slide? So history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. 1935 was a year where there was a very significant piece of legislation before Congress related to public utility companies. So related to energy companies, it ended up being the Public Utility Company Act. And when this legislation was pending, you clearly had stakeholders in the energy industry that were trying to influence members of Congress to support their view on this legislation. But what was a surprise was that there was so much public support and so much public activity related to this legislation. The members received over 250,000 Western Union telegrams in just a short amount of time. Back then, if you wanted to get a message to someone quickly, there's enough technology to not rely on a letter, but you could send a telegram. It was clearly before television, so the main way of doing a quick advertisement to try to get a campaign going to influence legislators at that point, if you were citizens, was to send a telegram. Well, initially this looked as though the citizens were just really concerned about what was going on and exercising the First Amendment right to speak to their legislators. But it turns out that one group of telegrams sparked more attention. And that was about 800 telegrams that one member received within about a 2-day time period. And he noticed that the last names of many of the constituents that were sending the telegrams all in the same alphabet, as though someone had just gone through the telephone book and put all these different names in there. So there was a huge investigation, congressional investigation. And when they peeled back the different layers, what they found was that behind all these telegrams was an electric company. It was the Association for Gas and Electric Company. And they had started this campaign where they paid Western Union employees to essentially forge these letters to make it seem as though there was a public campaign to influence this energy company legislation as opposed to coming directly from the energy company itself. So let's fast forward about 80 years or so to the next slide. 2019, we know the facts of this. You have a lot of public involvement with House Bill 6. You have these commercials on television with these individuals, these constituents, talking about their concern about big oil and the energy industry. And then instead of sending these videos and these ads over Western Union, the Facebook is what was used this time. And the investigation found that it was the energy company, First Energy, that was behind it all. Now, what do these two things have well, they have a lot in common, but in terms of what do they have in common with respect to reform? With what happened in 1935, it was the first significant conversation about lobbying law reform, about having lobbying law in the first place. There was no federal lobbying law when that first occurred. And this conversation that came out of the fact of not having a lobbying law focused on this point. If the entire reason for legislators to be in office is to serve the public interest, how can that do that if they don't know the public's interest? If the actual interest that is being portrayed before them is not the public's interest, but a special interest, they cannot operate in that situation. And they have to have disclosure. There has to be sunshine, as Professor Hill was discussing, to shine a light on what is really occurring so that legislators and the public can be aware of who's influencing these laws. So the same thing that happened in 1935 with this focus on lobbying law and the need for those regulations is what I think needs to happen now in 2020 when you try to think of the reforms that will be necessary to fix what occurred here. So let's talk more specifics. Let's go talk about what really is the lobbying law gap here. So let's move to the next slide. So to identify the gaps, I need to first just give you a very quick primer with lobbying law in general. Lobbying law is designed not to restrict anyone from lobbying, because that's a constitutional right. You must be able to speak to your legislator and be able to express any interest that you want. It is designed, on the other hand, to regulate the registration of who lobbies and the reporting of those lobbyists. It's two parts of all the lobbying laws. You register someone if they're engaged in the type of activity that you consider to be enough to be lobbying. And then they are required to do these periodic reports. And I know this is very basic, but it's very important to think about the different levers of how to reform lobbying law. Because the first part, the registration, can be very broad, which includes everyone. It can just be very broad to include just a little bit of lobbying, or it can be very narrow. That's the entire gate to the regulation in your registration law. And then the reporting can be completely useless if you're not requiring things of import to be listed periodically from those registered lobbyists. What does that mean for Ohio? So Ohio's current law is that you have to register as a lobbyist if you have direct contacts to influence the legislator. Clearly, it also involves executive action and also action with retirement board, but I want to focus right now on legislators. The key is that it's direct contacts. It does not include indirect contacts. So that if you meet with a legislator and you are trying to influence legislation and you have a few meetings one-on-one with yourself, or you send letters yourself, that may trigger registration. But if you have 200, 300, 400 people do the exact same thing to go communicate with that same legislator and express the same content that you have, that would not trigger lobby registration, which leaves a big gap. It's the grassroots lobby is what it's referred to. The next part is registration in Ohio. I'm sorry, reporting in Ohio. The reporting is very scant. It is a requirement to report 3 times per year, and that report only includes your lobbying expenditure. So let's say money you may spend on a meal or something connected with the lobbying, and the lobbying activity, which would simply say which bills or similar actions you lobbied on. So the gaps that happen with Generation Now, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with this organization, Generation Now, is that they conduct this entire campaign of spending $9.5 million to push out support for HB6. They never had to register. You don't know how much they spent on the campaigns. You don't know how much they spent on political contributions. You don't know about any expenses they had to benefit officials, such as gifts. These last 2 things are very important. And again, Professor Hill touched on this. The way that a lobbyist really engages with an official and has the access he or she needs is through campaign contributions, because those campaign contributions can be what are used to attend a fundraiser. They can be used just to be in this family of donors, such that when you make a phone call, that phone call is returned a little bit quicker because you are a donor. Same thing with expenses benefiting officials. Those are another word for that are gifts. Those gifts are used, such as wining and dining or receptions or travel, are used to gain goodwill with the legislator, and those should be reported. The donors to the organization, to Generation Now, that was something that was not known, as well as the affiliates of that organization. All right, so now that we know how to identify the gaps, how can we close these? And moving to the next slide, closing the gaps is not extremely complicated. It's not complicated from a legal perspective, may be complicated from a political perspective. Number one is to have grassroots lobbying qualify as lobbying. That is, indirect contacts should qualify as lobbying. The way other states do this is that there's a threshold, a monetary threshold on how much you spend to trigger this registration. So for example, if a company spends or organization spends or an individual spends $5,000 a month to engage in pushing out this influence to get third parties to contact a legislator, that will require registration. Second is what is disclosed. Campaign contributions of a lobbyist should be disclosed. Now, clearly we know that campaign contributions are disclosed under the campaign finance law, but it has now been seen that it's very effective to also have those contributions on the lobbying law. On the lobbying reports, so that everything can be seen together. You can see the timing, you see the push that the lobbyist was engaged in with the amount of the contribution, with the timing of the contribution, and all of that gives the public a clean picture of what may be potential conflicts of interest. Independent expenditures. Another word for independent expenditures is dark money. It is possible to have these organizations who may not be required to disclose their dark money under the campaign finance law, to have to disclose the independent expenditures under the lobbying law, and that has been done in other jurisdictions. Organizations affiliated with officials is another recipient that should be considered. And what I mean by that is, if this organization is contributing to another organization that is either run by, managed by, or created by a lawmaker, those should be disclosed. And finally, disclosures of the lobbyist affiliates, those other organizations tied to the donor, can be part of the registration requirement. So you put all this together, and you go back in history and you see, okay, what impact would this have had if it was around, if it were around the time that HB6 was introduced? This is what would have occurred. In April 2019, HB6 was introduced, and in May of that same year, Generation Now started their campaign, and they received $9.5 million from First Energy. At that point, under this law, or this reform, the registration would have been required for Generation Now to not only register as a lobbyist, but also to name the affiliate, that is First Energy, who gave them the money and who was involved in that lobbying activity. And then within, let's say 2 months later, if you change the reporting requirements so that it's like most places where it's either bi-monthly or monthly, there will be a report that showed how much money was spent, and also if there were any additional independent expenditures, political contributions made by that committee, those would have also been disclosed. So let's move to the last slide. I say all of these different proposals, and you can look at it and think, well, maybe that's just fantasy of how it's done. That could never pass anywhere. That's just positive thinking. Grassroots lobbying registration is a thing. I'm just putting some of the jurisdictions that have it here, but there are others that also have either grassroots lobbying registration, or there's no distinction between indirect lobbying contacts and direct lobbying contacts. Disclosure of lobbyist donations, that has occurred. It is, and it includes independent expenditures, and it includes political contributions, and it includes donations to the organizations that are just affiliated with lawmakers. And finally, disclosing the lobbyist affiliates, that is for Generation Now to have to disclose that they received the money from First Energy, that exists on the federal level. Right? So in closing, what I like to say is that when there are discussions about reform and lessons learned from this scandal, we should definitely include lobbying law reform in there. And the gaps that can be closed are pretty obvious, and that's with grassroots lobbying registration and more disclosures in your reports. All right. So thank you for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Kedric. You actually answered a lot of the things that were on my mind, and I still do have a few more questions for you, but I would like to invite everybody to go ahead and pop questions into the chat if you have them, and we'll try our best to get to them. I do want to start by noting an article I came across in just preparing for our meeting today. On September 21st, 2015, the Columbus Dispatch reported that in a study by the Center for Public Integrity, Ohio ranked 34th in its risk of public corruption. It received a overall D grade, and it received an F grade in monitoring lobbyists and their activities. And this is where I really want to ask your opinion, because the report noted that that Ohio has no shortage of ethics laws, but it has a history of state officials violating them. And so it does seem from what you're saying that there actually is some significant gaps in the actual laws. But in any case, whether we have those laws or not, here we are after the householder scandal. Do you believe that it was caused by the gaps in law or oversight and lack of accountability?
All of the above. So this was a very complicated scandal, because you had individuals who appear to be the type of bad actors who want to circumvent any existing law. So that's where the enforcement comes in place, but and it's very important to have it. So I think definitely there was not enough enforcement to try to catch these things, but there were gaps in the law that would not allow enforcement to really get involved. So for example, if you had the grassroots lobbying registration requirement, as soon as those commercials started to air and it said paid for by Generation Now, the lobbyists, the entity that enforces the lobbying law would know to look at the registration, to know to look at the disclosures of that entity to see whether or not there were some problems. And also, more importantly, it would allow the watchdogs in the state to look at those public disclosures and then alert the enforcement agency of what the problem is. So you have a problem of both the enforcement when the problem is known, and then also not having enough laws, well, not having certain laws that could have easily been triggered to alert the officials and the public of problems.
Thank you for that. Professor Ned Hill, he talked about the basis of some laws originating in the Public Utilities Commission, but obviously some of these lobby laws come from other places, namely probably the legislature. Do you know the origin of some of the lobbyist laws on the books now and how far they date back?
I do not know the vintage of the Ohio lobbying laws. I mean, there's certain things that stand out about the laws where it appears as though they're very dated. One thing is the disclosure. So if you would just, anyone who's attending this call could go to the database that is supposed to provide information about lobbyists, and typically you would be able to search for, let's say, all the lobbyists for a certain company, or all the lobbyists who are involved in lobbying a certain bill or something along those lines. It's not easy. You can't do that with the Ohio law. It's almost impossible to do that. You have to know the name of the lobbyist and know to search for the person. That is the type of, I would say, late 90s approach to not allowing the disclosure to be effective, because no one could actually conduct a useful search of the information.
And that in itself is a problem. I see our resident expert on dark money, Catherine Terser, noted that the original ethics law was enacted in 1973, and they were last updated in the 1990s. So we are way overdue for an update, especially after the last scandal that we are still kind of riding the wave of that last scandal. In your experience, since it seems that you have knowledge of kind of this kind of thing happening across the country, in your experience, when something like this happens, do we have a better chance of passing law reform in this area, and how do we do it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you have a great chance of passing it. And the one thing that has worked in the past with allowing people to pass this type of reform is if you have champions in the legislature who are actually elected on a platform to bring ethics reform. So if it's almost a mandate they have where their constituents expect it, and it's actually an issue that they can benefit from politically, then with that champion inside the legislature, then you have a better chance of it. And that just comes from continuing to do what you're doing, which is to get the public informed so that they can then push their elected officials to make a change.
I want to kind of write that point that you were talking about a little bit about how the public can get more involved and talk about that a little bit more. I think that this whole topic is really related to the issue that we have in the United States of relatively low rates of voting and civic engagement for a developed country, for a developed democracy. And I think in some circles where we might all come across people like this or circles like this, that there is a significant sense that their vote or their voice doesn't make a difference, or that it doesn't count. What do you feel more, if there's anything more than what you had just noted, that is the role of the public in this effort to ultimately strengthen accountability, reduce activities around corruption, and restore faith in our democracy?
I think that even this most recent election, where we had the highest voter turnout, I believe, in recent memory, people are starting to realize that each person has a voice, each vote counts, and as with all the recounts and things that are going on now, people see that you can make a difference. So I really think, unlike many points of time, this is a situation where people know that they can make a difference. And when it comes to ethics, there are typically organizations, Common Cause is the perfect example, that can get people motivated to just be a small group to find this champion that I described. Someone in the chat said, okay, who are these champions who may be the ones that can make a difference? Well, the obvious examples may be the people who run for the seats of those who are caught up in the scandal. They would almost obviously, you would think, come on a platform and trying to make change. And it's up to those people who support them, those voters who support them, to hold them accountable to anything that they pledge to change while they're campaigning.
I really appreciate that you noted small group, because that's what a lot of us in the democracy superstars are. We're small groups. Our executive director, Jen Miller, always says we're a small group carrying a mighty mission. And so I appreciate that. And I want to end with one of the questions we have posed here from William Davis. Can you give me more details on what would qualify a grassroots lobbyist to be registered?
The most effective threshold is going to be the monetary threshold. So you have the two parts. First is that you are engaging in an attempt to influence legislation. It can also be an executive action as well, but let's just talk about legislation route. So you're attempting to influence legislation with indirect contact with a lawmaker, and we call it a covered official, but it'd be a lawmaker, the lawmaker's staff. And you spend more than $5,000 within a month for that effort. Now that's typically going to cover someone who's buying ad time on television or buying, it could even be you're spending money like that for staff to organize the public to make those contacts. But the short answer to your question, it would be a monetary threshold, because that way you can enforce it and it doesn't become too vague, such that someone could circumvent the registration requirement.
Thank you. I think you gave us some really concrete examples of things to look for now moving forward in the wake of this scandal as we advocate for stronger lobby laws. And now we just have to wait to see what's going to happen to Householder, and hopefully somebody will come in on that campaign, on that platform of strengthening lobby laws. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Kedric.
Okay, thank you.
Catherine, I'm going to turn it back to you. I think you have some announcements for us about upcoming sessions and another poll.
I do have some announcements. I think as we listened to Kedric talk about champions, I think many of us kind of felt our hearts drop when we remembered that Larry Householder was reelected. And when we realized that one of the whistleblowers lost his job rather than being reelected. And so it's going to take a lot of us to find legislative champions. And one of the reasons, we began this promoting transparency at the State House is that we really need to put a spotlight and come together to actually move the legislature to take action. And I actually know that we are perfectly capable of that. Many of you on this webinar are the folks who collected signatures and moved the legislature to do redistricting reform. It's not very often that a state legislature takes up redistricting reform, first takes up state legislative redistricting reform, and then takes up congressional redistricting reform. And so we should be proud of our grassroots efforts. I was really interested in kind of thinking through the disclosure related to what we would call grassroots lobbying. And a lot of times we think of ourselves as grassroots lobbyists, and we're like, you want to know about our money? That we're not really spending much of anything. But what Kedric was really getting at is we should be able to know how much money is being spent on mailers. And we all received those House Bill 6 mailers, and we all saw those terrible political ads. And so we should be able to get to that good disclosure. I did have one little question, Kedric, if that's okay, Nazik. Okay, Kedric, this is my question. For a lot of us, one of the things that we hear fairly frequently is, hey, it's, disclosure, I'm not sure it's constitutional. So can you tell us why it is that grassroots lobbying, capturing, the paid mailers that are associated with moving legislation or TV ads or whatever it is, can you tell us a little bit about why that's constitutional?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to lobbying and the Supreme Court challenges of it going all the way back to the 40s, I believe, I'm thinking about Harris case. There's always been a discussion of what can you do when it comes to regulating lobbying. And it has been decided that the only true concern is if you start restricting someone's ability to lobby, but that disclosure can be done in a way that it is constitutional. And the distinction between disclosing as a lobbyist who's, let's say, a lobbyist for a corporate interest and a grassroots organization, I think would be very small. I don't see how a grassroots organization would be able to argue that their activity is of the nature that disclosure would in some way restrict their ability to lobby or disclose things that they don't want, that should not be disclosed. It's not as though you're disclosing all your members. It is disclosing the amount of money that you're spending and those who give you money at a large amount, so a significant amount. It can be a threshold. The federal law is if over $5,000 within a quarter and given by someone who directs or controls or is involved in lobbying. That type of threshold, I think, is reasonable. And constitutional challenge, I don't think would be strong. And the simple fact that you have these laws active in other states shows that it can be done in a constitutional way.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say thank you to both of you and to Professor Hill. And at this point, I just wanted to remind you that we are going to get together and have a conversation about some different ideas on December 7th. And so if you're willing to put in the poll for me, Mia, this is a community conversation on the 7th. Now, it seemed to me that we had 6 different topics, and it might be hard to have a conversation about each of the topics. And so we're doing this poll, we're doing some other kind of research to try to figure out which topics to do. We're going to have conversations with both an expert in the discussion group and a moderator so that we're able to kind of, one of the things I always think is you have these conversations and you have more questions. Okay, so this is the time for you all to vote. And so the first one is, would you like to talk about shining a light on dark money? Would you like to talk about improving Ohio's whistleblower law, which we know is just terrible? Would you like to talk about discovering who really writes Ohio's laws? This is about making sure that we have a more transparent legislative service commission so that we can understand who are the authors of legislation or the authors of amendments. Then improving direct democracy. One of the tools that we have is this ability to actually go to the ballot, but there are some real challenges and we should have a conversation about ways to improve it. So that's improving direct democracy. Then we have the last 2 topics from tonight. There's the restructuring the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, and then there's strengthening Ohio's ethics law. So you want to choose your top 2 or 3. So go for it. Okay, you know what I just saw? I saw that only 30% of you have voted. So let's get that up there. Not everybody has to vote. Oh, we're up to 30. Oh, we're up to 54. Let's give it 1 more minute and then we will close the poll. All right, we've hit that point. It's 66%. Can we go any higher? All right, let's see what the 72. Thank you guys. Okay, let's close the poll and see what we come up with. And drum roll, please. The number 1 topic is shining a light on dark money. The second, this is interesting, there are 2 that are in place. What's going to come forward? Is it going to be discovering who really writes Ohio's laws? Or is it going to be strengthening Ohio's lobbyists and ethics law? What we will do tomorrow, we'll be selecting the topics. We're going to go, we kind of assessed a couple different ways, and we'll be letting you know which ones we selected. But clearly you all have a commitment to greater transparency. And I just really wanted to thank you all, encourage you to participate on December 7th. And then finally, to say a great big thank you. I just so appreciate, the panelists. I appreciate Nazak. helping with some of the moderating, because I think it helps to get different voices. And I just wanted to thank you all for participating and thinking about what are the kinds of things that we can do together so that we don't have to put up with being ripped off, that we can actually create an Ohio that works for us. And I just wanted to say thank you all and good night. All right, y'all take care. Thank you again. I just really appreciate it. We're so grateful. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye.